Welcome to my channel, Delightful Stories. I'll be happy if you subscribe to my channel and like it. Enjoy watching and don't forget to leave your opinion in the comments about the story. The Trump Ace restaurant had a life of its own. Once upon a time, the place, which was founded by a former prisoner, came up with the appropriate name. In the 90s, the main criminal bosses gathered here. A couple of rooms were set aside for bedrooms, which were rented by the hour. There was always booze, available women, and a brand new deck of cards. Today, the owner of the place had changed, and a major renovation had taken place. The red velvet walls were replaced with something neutral. Pictures were hung, and the floor was tiled in ceramic, black and white. Chess-like. The owner of the trendy place ordered vintage tables. He really wanted to change the name, but he was afraid that it would be bad for visitors, because for many years people know this place as Ace of Chess. Business people and politicians would say, "Meet me in Tula," and everyone understood where the meeting would take place. The attitude toward business hasn't changed either. The restaurant became one of the best because the staff was always on the side of the customer. No one was ever offended here. The service was top-notch. Every single employee was taught to communicate with people, taught to react properly to different situations, which, of course, happen. For example, if a customer yells at the waitress, she won't run crying into the back and listen to her, but will apologize and think of how to fix it. Take the side of the customer, and if necessary, they will feed her for free. The restaurant has always taken care of such expenses. Another distinguishing feature of the place was that they did not look at the clothes and appearance of the visitors. A man could come here in a tracksuit, and he would still be served at the highest level. When there wasn't enough room in the hall, and that happened quite often, they didn't keep people who wanted to come inside. Extra tables were brought out for them at the entrance, and they were offered dinner in a separate room. Now there was no bedroom with available women. These rooms were a help to seat guests. It was also possible to reserve a table there in advance and dine alone. Sergio, there was some woman coming in. The homeless woman seems to be standing outside the restaurant, silent, unresponsive. "Should we call a doctor?" said one of the waiters. The young administrator Sergio shook his head. No need. I'll take care of it." "I know this woman," he replied with a smile. Sergio brought the grandmother food on a tray and stood next to her. She was at the main entrance, and Sergio was afraid that the owner would see it and scold her. He had been feeding the unaged woman with long gray hair for a week now. She said nothing, only thanked him with her eyes and left. Sergio himself grew up in a poor family, moved to the city with his mother. He got a job as a waiter in this restaurant to get back on his feet. He worked hard. The new owner, as soon as the manager's place became vacant, promoted him for his good work and good disposition. He said that the lack of higher education is not a problem. It is a misfortune if you lack education, intelligence. So Sergio started getting more money. In the same restaurant, he found both a friend and a beloved woman. His only companion was the assistant cook, a young ambitious guy who dreamed of becoming a chef, driving around in an expensive car and having a huge private house. Ted was also from a remote province, just like Sergio. His poor childhood made him too greedy and calculating. Sergio was embarrassed by these qualities of his friend, but everyone had his own faults, especially since Ted didn't consider them flaws. He often told Sergio that he, too, needed to be more assertive and set his sights higher. Julia, Sergio's girlfriend, worked as a waitress. She was the prettiest of all the people who worked there. Her beauty was obvious. Ted asked her out at first, gave her flowers, but the girl just waved her off. She liked him. However, after getting to know the guys better, Julia began to realize that maybe she acted rashly. Sergio, in her opinion, was the kind of guy who did not grab the stars from the sky. Ted, on the other hand, was promising. That's the kind of guy who would make it in life. What Sergio had to offer wasn't enough for her. The girl had long known she was beautiful. and was looking for a bargain for her beauty. She wanted to be worshipped, to be carried in her arms, to be provided for. She had invested a great deal in herself and her appearance, and therefore thought she deserved more. The girl did not dare to leave her current boyfriend, because she liked him better in terms of moral qualities, and the position of administrator paid better than the work of an assistant cook. Ted, too, did not dare to take a bold step and did not go beyond hidden hints and winks. Sergio, on the other hand, did not suspect anything. He firmly believed that he was happy because he had a girlfriend and a faithful friend. It was cool outside that day. Spring was already taking its toll, but the east wind was doing its part, making the puddles on the road once again covered with a film of ice. Granny stood in her warm-down jacket outside the restaurant, like a statue. She did not speak, was mute, and could only sometimes gesture to explain something to the benefactor. Back last fall, when she first came to the establishment, he warned her, "You come, but don't let our boss see you, or we'll get in trouble. He's a big guy with a black mustache, always angry, short in stature. He comes here in a big black SUV. As soon as he leaves for his lunch break, come by, there's plenty of food left over. Sometimes we take something home ourselves." From then on, Grandma would come to the door as soon as the chief's SUV was gone. There were days when she disappeared, but Sergio and the other concerned people in the restaurant already knew that Granny was coming in the afternoon. The other waiters also fed her, taking Sergio's initiative. Everyone understood they were doing it at their own risk, but the desire to help a needy person is usually higher in noble people than the fear of losing their job. The rain was drizzling, leaving drips on the windows. Sergio was busy writing. He did not go out into the hall. Granny carried her post, stood at the door, and waited to be fed. Finally, one of the waitresses brought her food in a plastic bowl. She took the plate, smiling. She thanked only with her eyes. She didn't care what they gave her, as long as they fed her. She only ate once a day more often. No one knew, but she lived on the street. Sergio brought her a jacket. One day he found a barely shabby down jacket in the trash on his way to work and decided to grab it for Clava, as the boys nicknamed her. She always ate very neatly, not like a bum, but more like a princess. This time, too, before she could get her food out, there was a teclava, the aristocrat's come against among the waiters in the restaurant. The boys never hurt her. They saw the way Sergio treated her, as if she were his own grandmother. The other boys also imbibed his nobility. He was hired as a receptionist for a reason. He knew how to set a good example. Is this an expensive restaurant or a beggar's shelter? A noise came up from behind Grandma. She barely had time to take her plate from the waitress's hands before she was pushed aside. The middle-aged man winced as he looked at her, and the waitress was terrified that she was going to get in trouble. What if this noisy guest was an acquaintance of the owner of the place? The man hurried inside. He was wearing his only really expensive jacket, and he didn't want to get it wet. The grandmother too slowly backed up, still blocking the aisle, and he shook his head and stepped sharply inside, realizing that he had pushed the old woman with his elbow. He didn't care about her. He had more substantial problems in his life than some old woman. The waitress was standing a little away, at the entrance. The whole thing happened right in front of her. The elderly woman stumbled when the rude man pushed her and fell, dropping her food. The waitress ran up to her, at which point Sergio appeared on the porch. He rushed to pick the woman up, not understanding what was wrong. The old woman was crying, but not because she was hurt, but because she had dropped her food. She would not have been able to eat off the ground. Her back was no longer strong enough to bend like that. "What is it? What's wrong?" he asked, knowing that Granny would not answer him. The visitor shoved her. "What a bore. Probably one of the big bosses. I hate people like that." "Inhumans," the waitress hissed. Sergio adjusted the handkerchief on her head, shook off her jacket, and wiped his face. "Don't be upset. More food will be brought to you in a moment. Take it with you and go, okay? Said Sergio. He ordered, and the grandmother was brought out food in a container with a plastic spoon. Sergio paid for this order himself. She was given potatoes, mashed chicken, and sauce. A double portion. He himself went to that very boar. He went into their establishment to order a table for the wake. The funeral would be tomorrow. I think we'll have everything out by 2 o'clock. But I can't say for sure. You know how it is, said the handsome brunette, who still had a look of squeamishness on his face. It looked like his usual grimace. Well, don't worry about it. A table for 12 will be waiting for you from noon to 5. Is that enough time for you? Sergio asked politely, perfectly hiding how much he wanted to send his guest away for his disgusting act. And even the fact that he was grieving did not justify the fact that he had insulted and pushed an elderly woman. It was necessary to remain human. Thank you. The man nodded. He asked Sergio a few questions about prices and menus. And when they had agreed on everything, the man relaxed and opened up. Yes, it was my fiancé's aunt who died. Horribly bad timing, to be honest. We had just set a date for the wedding. We had already started getting ready. We had the application, and then this happened. Sergio was confused. Apparently, the wedding was more important to this young man than the grief his beloved was now experiencing. Sergio only nodded understandingly. Yeah. It always happens suddenly. My grandmother, for example, died on December 31. Now every New Year we have not only a holiday, but also a wake. He lied. The man perked up, paid the deposit, and left, forgetting about the incident on the porch. Sergio exhaled as the front door closed behind the man. Serving such guests is not much of a pleasure. Meanwhile, a red-colored car was speeding through the wet, icy streets of the city. John was sitting behind the wheel, holding a cell phone receiver next to his ear. Yes, Anne, I made a deal. How are you holding up there, honey? Yeah, the wake's tomorrow. The kid's smart. Says he'll wait for us from noon to 5. So don't worry. It's not a wedding. There's plenty of time. He hung up the phone and threw it on the seat beside him. The black-haired man shook his head. Gigi, he said aloud. Just at 3 years of grooming. And just at the most inopportune moment, this old woman suddenly died, dropping all his masks. John sat behind the wheel of her car and used her money for gas. His excuse about temporary difficulties in the company couldn't last forever. Soon Anne would realize that John had no business whatsoever. Or rather, there was. But it had gone bust a long time ago. It all started 3 years ago. Anne was a friend of John's sister. She came to their town for the summer and threw the coolest parties. John and his friend had just graduated from college that summer. They both wanted to make money and had been working all year to put away some startup capital. The idea for the business belonged to John. And Bob, being the son of a simple philologist, also wanted to make his way and make a lot of money. John himself had grown up in a poor family, was not close to his parents, and did not remember his father. He had left the family for a young girl when he was not even 3 years old. His mother raised him alone and was angry with the world. Her sister had married a rich man, and she was left with a baby in her arms. John grew up in an atmosphere of oppression, and his mother's moods were passed on to him. He cursed poverty and secretly despised his cousin and her parents for living well. John promised himself to get out of poverty and would do anything for it. Once educated, he and his friend didn't plan a business. Except when it came to business, John decided he didn't want to share. He did the math and realized he had enough of his capital if he took out a small loan. The idea was his. He knew Bob wouldn't compete with him. Bob was a simple guy and only nodded when he heard that John was going to do his business alone. You're right. That's your idea. I'll do something else, maybe in another field. You'll see, we'll be rich together and we'll be fine, he said. That summer, both boys fell in love with Anne, but she chose Bob. He didn't even realize that his friend also had a claim on the beautiful girl. It all happened too quickly, in one single evening. And then for John began his personal hell. He and his wife shared an apartment. Bob was constantly talking about Anne, telling her how great she was and how he had fallen in love with her. John was angry, boiling inside, but silent, just like his mother, who was angry at everyone around her. She smiled at her sister, but behind her back, she hated her for being more successful in life. She was jealous of her friends and colleagues, too. It seemed to her that life had deprived her. John was slowly beginning to turn into the mother he had disliked, considered evil since childhood. Now he was beginning to understand her. Why did the pretty girl have to go to someone other than him? Everything was relatively quiet. For the first few days, John had been moving topics around in his head, plotting how he was going to take her away from his friend. Only it wasn't supposed to look like his pathetic attempt to win the girl back, but like his triumphant victory. As if everything had come easy to him, as if he was so good that Anne herself had fallen at his feet. He wanted to make his friend feel the same emotions, the same envy, the same jealousy that he felt now. But Anne looked only at Bob. She had fallen in love with him, and John was to her only the boy who lived in her lover's apartment. She did not perceive the boy, did not pay any attention to him. She had already made her choice in the first day she met Bob. From there it was even worse. John found out that the girl was rich, and he began to bite his elbows. Bob didn't react to the news. He shrugged his shoulders and said he would work hard for her to provide the same conditions he was already used to. A friend took up a business plan, and John thought it looked promising, but it would take a very long time to work for pennies. He, on the other hand, dreamed of getting rich quick and followed his plan. They began to turn their dreams into reality. By then, Anne was practically living with them. She proudly talked around the house in a Bob t-shirt and kept suggesting that John introduce him to his girlfriend. It's kind of awkward that the two of us and you are alone. It's like if we were eating and you weren't getting any. She's great, what have you got to lose? The girl persuaded him. He was evasive, but at some point he gave in. I will not meet anyone. You want to eat, eat. And I do not want. I'm not hungry, all right? He went headlong into business and soon got his first fruits. He bragged about it at dinner, expecting the girl to look at him differently. But the guys were only happy for their mate and got involved with each other again. Soon John got tired of seeing this couple together. His feelings for this girl wouldn't go away, and he didn't know what to do. Confess to them now. To what end? They would both drift apart so they wouldn't hurt him, but they certainly wouldn't break up over it. So John just took out a mortgage on the apartment. As soon as the opportunity arose, he moved out and started living his own life. He still went out with the guys, only now each time he tried to show that he had become a businessman and influential. He wanted to be envied because he himself was just dying of envy, looking at how well his friend was doing with his sweetheart. A year later, the boys got married. They did it secretly and only later reported it. The girl's parents did not approve of their daughter's choice. Her father wanted to find a groom for her from his circle of friends. It would have been comprehensively beneficial to the businessman. Can you imagine? We are now husband and wife. Anne showed her friend the hand with the silver ring. She was glowing with joy. Bob was happy too. He stood beside her and showed off his ring too. Beautiful. Congratulations. What's so urgent? The bride is pregnant, he asked, trying to hide his horror at what he was hearing. No. It's just that my parents are really against our relationship, and they don't even want to hear about the wedding, and we want to be husband and wife. We've been together a long time, and it's for real now. John let out a smile and congratulated them. He realized that day that he would fight for his happiness. If he let the girl get her husband pregnant, there was nothing he could do. That would be the end. Wouldn't take her with someone else's baby, would it? Such a scenario he couldn't have imagined. Thinking back to those desperate times, John could no longer remember what a sorry state he had been in. Now, however, everything was working out just fine for him. In the evening, John went to his fiancée, who was wearing black. "How long will you wear mourning?" John asked her. The girl was a skinny beauty with lush hair. She was sitting on the bed, looking through an old photo album. "You know, I didn't have a grandmother. My father was an orphan, and my parents died early. When I was 14, my aunt came to our house. She was my mother's own sister, 9 years older. My parents were happy to see her, but I thought she was too strict. But in time it turned out that I had much more in common with her than with my mom and dad. Aunt Olia was the only one who supported me when I fell in love, and she helped me the most to find his mother when she helped me the most to find his mother when she disappeared. It was very strange. She was the one who suggested I get into programming. She was the only one who didn't see anything wrong with a girl getting into computers. My parents scolded me for playing games, for running both language and literature, and for learning programming languages at 16. They saw me as anything but a programmer. My mother frightened me that I would age faster because of my sedentary job, even though she herself sat in her office for hours. She wanted me to go into politics, following in her footsteps. My father didn't care about my passion at all. He wanted me to go into his business. I was an only child, and only my aunt, who had been married 3 times and was interested in what I wanted. Like her, I was orphaned with living parents. John listened to the bride and shook his head. He put on a sympathetic face and sighed. "My darling, how hard it has been for you. You've lost 3 people close to you in 3 years. But I'm sure if your aunt were alive, she'd want you to be happy now. Are you sure you should postpone the wedding?" He was still hoping she would change her mind. "I don't have time for a wedding. I'm grieving, you know. I can't wear white until at least 40 days have passed. It's not right, and my parents would judge me. What if we don't celebrate the wedding? What if we just got married, like you guys did, and then on our first anniversary, we have a banquet, and we wouldn't have to bankrupt your parents? I'm broke myself right now. It's not going well, but I've solved all my problems. And on our first anniversary, we could go to Paris or the sea. What do you say?" Anne smiled weakly. Sure, she didn't love him, but there was no one close to her who would be so supportive. He was the one who had organized the search party, raising people from the area when Bob's mother went missing. It was a couple of weeks after their wedding. The woman had just disappeared. Bob was very worried, but Anne was even more worried. Mary, her mother-in-law, was very warm to the girl. 6 months later, there was more grief. Bob was doing very well. He got a lot of money, bought a car, was going to take out a mortgage on the house. But his car went off a cliff. It was John who was the most supportive of Anne at the time. She cried all day long. Doctors were called to her. She was injected with serious medication, so she wouldn't hurt herself with her strong emotions. No one could understand how he ended up on that coast and why he moved away. Forensics showed that he had been drunk. It was only a friend who revealed the truth. After the funeral, he confessed that his friend had prepared a surprise for her. That day, he was celebrating another success in business, had a few drinks, and went to find a place for the banquet. He was going to use all the money to throw a party right by the bay. He wanted it to be a surprise for his wife and her family. He was tired of worrying and just wanted to celebrate his success with those closest to him, but apparently he couldn't cope with the steering and the car crashed down. The girl was surprised. It didn't sound like him at all. But the boy convinced her by telling her how much he had been worried about his mother's disappearance. After such emotions, anyone would want to let the situation go and just get drunk. The boy himself was in his office at the time his best friend had died. He, too, was shocked by the news, and as soon as he found out, immediately went to pick up Anne. They were about to go through a lineup. For another year and a half, the deceased's wife had been a grieving widow. She had worn mourning. All that time she did not want to live, and all the time she did not want to live. And only a friend was always there for her. The guy had loved her for a long time, and he openly confessed to that as well. What was there to do? She always had John by her side. He spent a lot of time on her, pulled her out of depression, arranged surprises, took her to the woods with a tent, and never once was tactless, though he really wanted to. When he opened up to her, he told her that he had been in love since the first day they met. Anne decided she was obliged to give him a chance. She felt gratitude and affection for him, but it was not love. Gradually he tamed her, accustomed her to always being there for him, and she was no longer comfortable if the guy went out of town to his parents for a couple of days. She missed him and mistook it for love. But the closer the wedding date came, the clearer she realized she didn't love him. However, John was a promising businessman. The girl's parents supported the choice after the tragedy. They saw that her late husband's best friend was ready to be there for their daughter day and night. It seemed to them that he wasn't a bad option for their grief-stricken Anne. They just couldn't ask her to look at anyone else. Her parents were terribly afraid for her after the funeral. She was out of her depth with grief. If she chose John, so be it. He was a businessman, and the girl's father was already ready to help him in a friendly way after the wedding. John mentioned that business was almost at a loss right now, but promised that he would sort it out himself. In fact, he was counting on his father-in-law for help. Besides, if he married Anne, he could declare himself bankrupt and get into her father's business. It was much more successful and developed not only in their city, but in the whole region. And as luck would have it, just before the wedding, the girl's aunt died. The bride immediately postponed the celebration and plunged back into mourning. John sincerely sympathized with her. He really loved her, but there was no way he wanted to postpone the wedding. What if this event would make his beloved turn away from him? What if during the time the wedding was postponed, it would become known that his business had long ceased to exist, and all the time he had only been dusting his eyes and working part-time in the office of a transport company? He was afraid the deception would come out. The girl's parents will turn on him and realize that he cares about their money, not just his daughter, and force him to call off the wedding. And then all the effort he had devoted years of his life to would go to waste. There was no way he could let that happen. However, his argument worked, and Anne said she would think about getting married quietly and then have the party in a year. Then all the excitement would be over for sure, and she could finally feel happy around the man who loved her. The night passed quickly. It felt like John had just closed his eyes. Fatigue and funeral preparations had taken their toll. He hated such events. He was afraid of the dead and was generally a very squeamish man. He got out of bed, took a shower, and entered Anne's house at the right time. There were a lot of people there. The wealthy parents, as usual, had left the doors open so that everyone could come in and say goodbye. My aunt was childless. She had had rubella as a child. The disease was severe, and it was not a question of her being able to get pregnant, but whether the girl would survive. After she recovered, the doctors told her the unpleasant news. She had married 3 times, and all 3 of her spouses were at her funeral, telling her how pure, brave, and kind she had been. What had happened came as a huge surprise to everyone. What a surprise! She slipped in the bathtub, hit her head, and drowned. And she wasn't even 60 years old yet. After a hard and somber procedure, at which everyone cried except John, loved ones went to a wake at a restaurant. John tried his best to hide the bored look, but could not. I noticed that he was indifferent to everything that was going on. On the way to the restaurant, she told him so. You know, you could show some respect. I mean, she's gone, she said. John sighed. He was beginning to get annoyed that things weren't going according to plan. "I'm sorry, but your aunt didn't like me. You know what she said to me the last time I saw her. She said she wouldn't let us get married. She said so many nasty things to me, and I didn't deserve it. I was a loyal friend, that's all. And the fact that I've always loved you, you can't tell your heart. But I kept quiet. I stayed out of your way, and I didn't put any sticks in your wheels. So I still feel resentment," he said in a half-whisper, but quite harshly. She knew her aunt disliked him, but she didn't listen. She had no argument to prove her suspicions, and the boy seemed crystal clear to her. "Honestly, I didn't know your aunt had hurt you so much. What on earth did you do?" "Born, I guess." The bride stroked his hair. "You don't have to be mad at her. We just buried her. She's gone. Let's forget all the hard feelings and remember the good things. She was an old woman, but we all will be." He sighed, looking somewhere in the distance. "Do you think I'm going to be an old woman too?" he asked. She smiled, and he took in her smile. "I know it's not the time to smile, but I can't help it. Every minute you are with me, my happiness, I want you to smile too." Anne kissed her fiancé on the cheek. She did feel better, but so did he. John thought that now the wedding would take place as planned, and Anne or her father would help him with things. He would never be in need again. All he had to do was join her family, and then it would be a matter of little else. There was another reason he was in such a hurry to get married. Anne was denying him intimacy. She had not yet recovered from her husband's death, and they had agreed that it would happen on their wedding day. It would be the right thing to do, and according to tradition. He couldn't wait to get his own. He was one step away from being happy and successful. The car stopped outside the restaurant. The boy got out and took the girl's hand. Just outside the restaurant, he noticed the old woman who had stopped him the day before. He rolled his eyes, but did not make a scene in front of his fiancée. She'd be upset and angry and cancel the wedding. Anne felt sorry for everyone, beasts and bums alike. It was impossible to show that he looked at these things differently. He believed that everyone chooses their own destiny, and life provides options. If you became homeless, it means you wanted it for yourself. With these thoughts in mind, he went to the restaurant. "You? It was you. You killed my son." For a fraction of a second, the boy was dazed. The voice seemed familiar. He turned his head and saw the face of an older woman. It was she. Panic gripped him. His hands trembled. Anne was on the other side. He was fending her off from the older woman. Something had to be done. The grandmother was coming right at him, and he pushed her with both hands so that she would fall, and the girl would not see her face. She was crazy. My God, she came at me. I thought she had a knife in her hand. Anne, when she saw John push her grandmother, wanted to approach her, but he stopped her. "Are you out of your mind? Maybe she's schizophrenic. It's spring. They have different exacerbations. Stay away from her. You heard her screaming that I killed some son of hers." She was confused and frightened, and the groom had already taken her under his arm and almost led her inside. "Daughter, he killed Bob. He did it. I heard everything." Anne froze in the doorway, and John's hands visibly shook. "He's been exposed." She looked at her fiancé and at the relatives who were crowding around the entrance, watching what was happening. She pushed the guy's hand away and tried to approach the woman, but he held her back forcibly. "Let go," she said, trying to understand what was going on. The grandmother called out the name of her late spouse. Her name and her voice were familiar, only very hoarse. John grabbed her by the arms. "Stay away from her. She's crazy. She was here yesterday and heard me talking to the receptionist. Yeah, she heard all the names, so she's talking nonsense." At that moment, Sergio showed up on the porch. He saw something going on outside and rushed to help. When he saw the grandmother lying on the doorstep, he rushed to get her up. John was still trying to get the girl inside. She looked at the woman, trying to recognize her. You'd get the bums out of the aisle already. Yesterday she was here. Today she's attacking me. It's an outrage. He came out. At that moment, the receptionist lifted the tramp to her feet, and the girl saw her face. She pushed John away sharply, and he tried to stop her, grabbing her arms. Stop! I'll explain everything to you. She's lying. You, let me go, Anne yelled. John slapped her in the face in frustration. Come to your senses, she's crazy. It only took Sergio a few seconds. He flew over to John and punched him in the face. He fell, and Anne walked over to her grandmother and peered into her face. Is that you, Mary? Papa, Mama, it is Mary. She's alive. Hold him, she shouted, noticing that John was trying to escape. Sergio immediately stopped him and twisted his arms, then took him inside and locked him in the back room. What the hell is going on here? Why is this man beating up old people and women? He probably beats kids too, he just didn't have any, Sergio said. Anne smiled at her savior. She held the hand of her mother-in-law, who finally went inside the restaurant where she was being fed. They sat down at the table. Sergio took the groom's seat, and before he did, he called the police. Mary insisted on it. Thank you, son, for everything. You must have saved more than one life. Anne, tell me, my son, is he alive? Anne didn't know how to say that to her mother. She shook her head and dropped 2 tears. The waiters quietly carried the dishes ordered to the table. Everyone around was silent. It was interesting to hear Mary's story of how it all came about. After all, Anne, I heard him on the phone. When they answered, he called my son's name and said he wanted him gone. He didn't care how, as long as it was sooner. He said he had already transferred the money. I heard the phone say, I consider him dead already, and I didn't know what to do, so I just came out from around the corner and started scolding him. I yelled that my son hardly thought he was his brother and didn't know what kind of snake he had on his chest. Then I told him I called the police. He said I'd misunderstood. But I heard everything. I heard everything with my own ears. It was quiet outside, and I was standing just around the corner, a few meters away. When I spoke out and turned around, he hit me on the head with something. Probably with a rake. There was a garden rake. I woke up in a dumpster. I had a tremendous concussion. I tried to get up, but I couldn't. There were birds circling over my head. I waited for someone to come. I was found almost 24 hours later by boys. They were looking for something at the city dump. I asked them to help me. They called my parents, who called for help. Children thought I was just drunk. They brought me to the hospital. I was there for almost a month, and I didn't remember anything. The doctors said it was a form of amnesia. I couldn't remember anything from my life. I didn't even know who the president was. Just a white sheet. They taught me to live again. They didn't discharge me for a long time because I had nowhere to go. They wanted to report me missing, but my roommate frightened me and said they probably wanted to kill me and would kill me if they found me. I left the hospital at night, left a note, thanked the nurses and doctors for everything, wrote that I remembered everything, and went to my family. I lived in a small apartment in the school. The men worked there during the day, and at night they would leave me there and go home themselves. That way I had a place to sleep, and it was good for them. They would go home to their families, and once a month they would give me some money from my salary. They were supposed to take care of the heating, but it was an old system, and I figured it out pretty well with their help, and there were no problems. So they kept me, and I did some of the work for them. That's how I lived all that time. During the day, I wandered around town, begging, being fed at the church. Then I came to this restaurant, and Suryosha gave me food somehow. Looking at it, I remembered my son, as if I remembered that I had a son and remembered that he was dead. It was deposited in my memory. And it wasn't until I saw your face, Anne, and remembered everything, that I felt as if I had already come to terms with his death. But now I feel differently. The girl and the other people at the table were crying. We were so looking for you. Bob believed to the last minute that you would be found. John then canceled the murder order. And when did my son die? I thought he was killed right away. After all, the man on the phone said he could already be considered dead. Anne sighed. It didn't make sense in my mind. He died 6 months later. Apparently, the bastard had canceled the order. He didn't want to draw much attention. First you disappeared, then Bob would die too. I think he was waiting for you to be found dead. He was sure you were dead. My God, he's the one who organized the whole search party. They looked for you everywhere. At the dump too. He wanted you to be found dead. Then he would have been relieved that his plan hadn't been discovered. Mary. His car fell off a cliff. He was drunk and drove there. John said he was planning some kind of surprise for me. And now I realize there was not a word of truth in his eyes. Inhuman. Anne stood up from the table. There was a glint of rage in her eyes. Take me to him. I want to talk, she said to the receptionist. He sighed. One of the guests began to tell Mary about the death of her aunt, and the boy took his guest into the back room. You made a mess of things. Now, wait a minute. The police are on their way. They've got interrogators. They'll solve this case. Believe me, it wasn't me. I heard it from behind the door. Honey, it's not what your old lady said. That's a lie. I made the arrangement on the phone, and it was about Bob dying of excitement. I wanted to give him a present. Mary yelled at me and I left. What happened next, I don't know. And how can you say I killed him? He was like a brother to me. Sergio opened the door, and John immediately tried to leave the room. In one deft move, the administrator pushed him back in. Stay there. You'll have to explain to the police, he commanded. How could you? Asked Anne, not knowing what was in that man's mind. She was frightened that he had been with her all this time. How could I, you say? How could he take you away from me? I fell in love with you at first sight. You're mine. He didn't even ask me. Yeah, your Bob tried to beat me everywhere. He saw how much I loved you, but he told me about you every day and brought you home. Yeah, you gave me hell, and then my business went down. And his went up. And you got married. What was I supposed to do? What was I supposed to do? Give up and go back to my village? Yelled John. His nerves gave out. All these years he had been accumulating emotions that had broken his psyche. He had longed to speak out loud all his worries, wanted to be heard. Did you kill Bob? She asked tearfully. I did. Do you think he would have guessed to die himself? No, he wanted to live and poison my life every day. Your husband was a real jerk. I hated him. I waited until time had passed since his stupid mother disappeared, who liked to eavesdrop around the corner, and I called him to the cliff. You know what was symbolic? I hit him over the head with the same rake. But first I poured him a drink and told it like it was. I told him that I had loved you since day one and that he was a bone in my throat. And what do you think your adoring husband did? He started apologizing. Said he didn't know how I felt about you. Bullshit. He knew everything. He couldn't help the way I looked at you. We started arguing, and I hit him over the head. I stunned him. He was still alive when I put him in the car, and just before the abyss, he woke up and looked at me. I could see him trying to get out, but the car was already at the very edge. That panic in his eyes was priceless. Sometimes I think of his face before I go to sleep, and I sleep better. Anne put her hand over her mouth, and John tried to get out again, and again the receptionist dashingly pushed him inside. She turned away and was about to leave when he called out to her, I'm not finished. Honey, your adorable aunt didn't slip in the bathroom on her own, either. I helped her. And she told me straight out that she was going to interfere with our wedding. No, she didn't know anything, but she sensed it. She said I was a bad person and I wasn't right for you. and I pushed her when she was in the bathroom and she fell. I should have locked the door from the inside. I saw her drown. My God, you're crazy, a real psycho, the girl whispered in horror. Sergio punched him in the face and he fell, hitting the corner, but he wasn't squirming in pain. He was laughing. Sergio locked him in and told the waiters to stay away, and hesitated to go into the hall. She stood there in front of the entrance and cried. Sergio walked over and hugged her. She hugged him and cried on his shoulder for about 10 minutes, then looked at him. I'm sorry. I'm just not myself. That's not surprising. It's not easy to get over something like that, but you can't bring back what's gone. You couldn't have known this man was mentally ill. I don't even think he's going to jail. I don't even think he's going to just send him to a mental hospital, unfortunately, Sergio said. They got to talking. Anne went to the table far away, and Sergio went to see if anyone accidentally opened the door to the back room. At the door stood his best friend Ted. In his hands was a stack of cash. What have you done? Sergio shook his head. I could buy a car with this money, and the guy would still get caught by the police. Don't worry, he said, relaxed. There was no time to sort it out. He ran after the criminal and caught him in the street. A fight ensued. The murderer had no intention of giving up. He beat the administrator and won, but could not stop in time. Sergio had already fallen to the ground, but he kept kicking him, punching him in the face and stomach. He was so angry. At that moment, a police car pulled up. The officers quickly ran out and grabbed John. I'm the one who called you. The man is a murderer. We have cameras, and one of them should have his confession on it. I'll show you. He tried to get up, but he couldn't. A sharp pain in his ribs knocked him back, and he screamed. He was helped up and walked to the restaurant. Anne, seeing him like this, rushed to him. God, what happened to you? You were fine a minute ago. She was inside at the table and didn't see what had happened. Sergio was approached by Ted. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Yeah, fuck you, Sergio snapped back. Pack your things so I don't see you here again. You're fired. It's not up to you, shouted Ted. The restaurant owner will watch the cameras and see how you let the criminal out for money. And I'm going to recommend that you be fired under the article. So I advise you to write a letter of resignation. Ted walked out in silence. The police took his statement and let him go for a while. The proceedings began. The owner of the restaurant also arrived. The police officers asked for a bonus for the manager and promised to write a letter of thanks for the help in finding the dangerous criminal. Anne did not take one step away from him. His girlfriend was obviously looking at them obliquely. When the doctors arrived, they took him away for x-rays with suspected broken ribs, which were later confirmed. In the evening, when Sergio returned home, his girlfriend called him. He was shattered with terrible pain in his ribs, despite the strong painkillers the doctors had injected. My face was smashed, everything hurt. I've seen you beat up rich people, and your best friend. Because of her, you threw your friend out. Ted didn't do anything. How could you do that? He just opened the door. He didn't know the guy was crazy. Julia, I warned everybody that there was a criminal locked in the back room and that the police were coming, and he let him out for money. What are you talking about? I didn't have the energy for a scandal at all. I saw you two hugging. Julia, her husband, died. That bastard killed him and her aunt. And he told her everything, laughing like a lunatic. I didn't think such crazy people existed. I didn't think such crazy people existed. I just helped and supported the man, that's all. You wouldn't fight for me? That's what you do for the rich, isn't it? What do I care? I'm just a waitress. She hung up. The boy shook his head and thought he would have to explain it to her again. She was wrong, but there was no energy left for that. A week went by, she didn't call again, and Sergio wasn't in a hurry to call her either. Something ticked inside after everything that had happened. It seemed that Ted was something like that psycho. Also the best friend to whom money was more important than humanity. Sergio hated such personalities and did not understand how for so long he could not see it in him. Or rather, he had noticed it, but he had turned a blind eye to it, banished such thoughts from his mind. And it was not just money hunger. It was greed, and a man like that was capable of anything, and John was the best proof of that. Sergio went to work even though the doctors had forbidden it. Sitting at home was boring. The restaurant's Ted did give the guy a bonus, but most of it went to his treatment. When he crossed the threshold of the restaurant, everyone around him applauded. Sergio was greeted like a hero. He went to work, and at the end of the day, 2 women entered the restaurant. He recognized one at once. It was Anne. When he saw her, Sergio hurried to say hello, but when he saw him flying, Julia blocked his way. What? So she's going to come here to you now? That's why you don't call me. Sergio shook his head. He was confused. At that moment, Julia was called and she left, throwing him a disdainful look. Sergio managed to approach Anne. Good afternoon. Good to see you. He said hello. Good to see you too, son, her companion said. Sergio looked more closely and realized that their aristocrat was standing next to her. It is you. Oh my goodness, you look like an English queen, he exclaimed. You did not call me... She had changed beyond recognition. For 3 years she had not looked in the mirror, as if afraid of her reflection, because it looked at her strange and unfamiliar face. Now she remembered everything. She remembered the face of her now-deceased husband and son. She remembered her loved ones, and surrounded her with care. They couldn't get enough of talking the first night, and even stayed with her mother-in-law. They slept in the same room. Mary would lie down on the bed, and Anne would sleep next to her on the little couch. She was insanely happy that a woman had been found. Before going to the restaurant, she took her to a beauty salon, where the woman was completely transformed. Her long hair was cut and chemically permed. She always wore her hair that way before. Manicure, pedicure, and facial treatments were done. A specialist painted and adjusted her eyebrows. She came out of there looking about 20 years younger. Sergio escorted them to their table. Anne said they were meeting the owner of the restaurant tonight. The mustachioed man actually sat down at their table shortly thereafter, and they talked about something for a long time. After their dinner was over, Sergio caught up with Anne already at the entrance. Mary tactfully retreated to the restroom to let them talk. I was wondering how you were doing after all this craziness. I'm coming to my senses. And how are you? Did you get beaten up a lot because of that? No. It was already the fault of a man I mistook for a friend. You know, after that story, I'm going to be wary of every man I meet. I thought he was a friend. Yes, a brother. I didn't think he was capable of such a thing either. Sergio sighed. I realize this is going to sound inappropriate. But if you want to talk about all this, give me a call. Just don't take this the wrong way. I'm not going to take John's place, and I promise not to kill your loved ones. He smiled and laughed. I can see the difference. I see it now. You look like Bob in some ways. My mother-in-law says you always reminded her of her son. I'll leave you my number. Call me if you want to meet. You don't have to look for an excuse. I don't have any friends or girlfriends left because of recent events. My parents want me to go back to a normal life, and I don't even have anyone to go to the movies with. So I'll be glad to hear from you. That same night, her sweetheart came to the receptionist's house and said that she was tired of being separated and wanted to make up. The suitor told her that they could not be together, but they simply did not fit together, being different people. She turned around and left. The next day, the owner of the cafe gathered all the employees in the hall for a 5-minute meeting. I want to announce to you the change in management. For a long time, I was looking for an opportunity to leave, but the business would not let me. And now, friends, I'm going to my children and grandchildren and grandchildren. They live in Germany and have been asking me to visit them for a long time. And I want to introduce you to the new owner of the restaurant. You know him well. Sergio? The guy was taken aback. What? How can that be? I'm just an administrator. I didn't buy the restaurant. Mary asked the girl to buy the restaurant and give it to you as a thank you. You didn't let her starve to death. Treated her the best, and you also helped catch that psycho who was killing everybody there. By the way, the police did a medical examination. He doesn't have any disease. Well, of course there is. People with a healthy psyche don't become like that. But he is not subject to treatment. He will go to jail. And most likely he will go to jail, and most likely he will get life imprisonment. He sings like a nightingale. He's got the whole story. He confessed to everything. So Sergio took the reins. In the evening, he called Anne. I didn't expect. Why did you spend so much money? It was enough to say thank you. I'm terribly embarrassed. It was my mother-in-law's wish. She lives with us now. She said she wanted to thank you. Said you were the heart and soul of this restaurant and should own it. Of course, I complied with her request. Sergio shook his head. Should I make her a part owner? He asked. She doesn't have time to work in a restaurant. She's been wandering the streets for 3 years. At least they'd let her sleep in the boiler room. She has a lot of rehabilitation and therapy ahead of her. That's what my parents are doing now. You can sell the restaurant now if you want. No. It's become like my home. I'm gonna make sure this place thrives. And there'll always be a table for you. I wish she'd come more often. We miss her. She's been a part of our family for a long time, just like the rest of us. By the way, would you like to go to a horror movie? They say they're showing a horror movie about a maniac tonight. Anne laughed. I'd love to. I don't have enough maniacs in my life. But seriously? Shall we go to the cinema? Let's go. They went to an adventure movie and discussed it half the night on the phone. That's where their romance quietly began. The widow's parents, after everything that had happened, feared that she would be alone and withdrawn forever. When the manager began to visit her, they rejoiced. But they were also seriously frightened by the John story themselves. So soon after their affair began, her father called the boy into his office. I'd like you to see a psychiatrist, he said to his forehead. Don't take this the wrong way. If you don't mind, it's for my daughter. He didn't know how to respond. I get it, he said. A particular one, or do you have one of your own? Sergio took the address, but at the door he turned around. I'll go, but I would advise you to go to him too. He said that and left. My father sat down in his computer chair. He's got the whole family on our backs. After the killer went to jail, Mom made an appointment with a psychiatrist. She understood that they all needed someone who could explain the criminal's behavior and help them get through it all. The psychiatrist was a part-time psychologist, an excellent specialist. Sergio did what the girl's father asked, and the doctor confirmed that he had a healthy, strong psyche. The father asked the boy to forgive him, and together they drank a glass of cognac. That put an end to the conflict. A few months later, the boy invited his beloved to live with him. She still went to psychological counseling, and the doctor said that a change of scene would do her good, so she put her suitcases in his apartment. She fell in love with him almost at first sight. He acted like a hero. He had everything she loved about her dead husband, but there was a lot more. He was a guy with a great sense of humor, could find the funny in even the most unpleasant situation, and knew how to laugh at himself. His jokes never sounded out of place. They had a great time. Together they took turns choosing and watching movies, walking around the city, wandering through the stores. One day the girl walked into her parents' house as if the nightmare events had never happened. She smiled, and her smile sparkled with joy. "Mom, Dad, I'm getting married. Sergio proposed to me." Her father and mother congratulated her. My mother-in-law was also very happy for her. She immediately advised her to take a closer look at Sergio, and was embarrassed because she was her son's wife. Only after some time, having come to her senses, the woman was able to mourn him, often went to the grave visiting him. Anne also went with her, but in doing so she always told her daughter-in-law not to turn her life into mourning. She was too young to make a cross on herself. "Honey, aren't you in a hurry?" her mother asked her. "We are. In 6 months you will be grandparents, so we're in a hurry." In his joy, the father opened the champagne and got everyone in the family drunk except his daughter. In the evening, there was a party at home where the wine was opened again and toasts were sounded. The wedding was played in the usual family way. She wore a beautiful dress. There were doves and photo shoots and a bride price. She officially became a wife that day, and after the due date, her daughter was born. She wanted to name her after her first husband, and her father didn't mind, but her mother-in-law did. "Sir, do you want to honor her? Put a candle in the church. But don't name a child after someone who didn't live his life. It's not nice. You should name it after those who lived happily and died in old age. Often I suggest we call it Alien," Sergio said. For some reason that name seemed very affectionate and gentle to him. Anne nodded. "It's a good name. It would suit our little girl for sure." "It is decided then. You will be Alien," said the father of the newborn, looking into her beautiful blue eyes.